The discovery. The morning mist clung to the French countryside like a shroud as Marcel Dubois made his way through the overgrown field behind his family's barn. It was September 1943, and the war had transformed his quiet village into a landscape of whispers and shadows. At 17, Marcel had learned to move silently, to notice everything, and to trust no one beyond his immediate family. He was checking the rabbit traps when he heard it, a low metallic groan that didn't belong to the natural sounds of the forest. Marcel froze, his heart hammering against his ribs. German patrols had been more frequent lately, and any unusual sound could mean danger. But curiosity, that dangerous companion of youth, pulled him forward. Pushing through a thick wall of brambles, Marcel stumbled into a small clearing he'd never noticed before. What he saw made him gasp. Partially hidden beneath broken branches and torn canvas was an aircraft. A British Spitfire by the looks of it, its distinctive elliptical wings bent but not broken. The plane had clearly crashed months ago, perhaps even a year, given how nature had begun to reclaim it. Marcel circled the wreckage carefully, his mind racing. The cockpit was empty, the canopy shattered. Blood stains on the seat told a grim story, but there was no body. The pilot had either been captured or had managed to escape. The plane itself was remarkably intact for a crash landing. The fuselage was dented and scratched, one wing was crumpled, and the propeller blades were twisted like gnarled fingers, but the basic structure remained sound. He knew he should walk away. Possessing or hiding British military equipment could get his entire family executed. The Germans had made that abundantly clear with the bodies they'd left hanging in the village square last spring. But as Marcel ran his hand along the cold metal of the fuselage, something stirred in his chest. A wild, impossible idea. Before the war, Marcel had spent every spare moment in his uncle's garage, learning the mysteries of engines and mechanics. He'd taken apart and reassembled every motor vehicle that came through their village. His uncle used to joke that Marcel could make a tractor run on hope and wire if he had to. Now, looking at this wounded bird of war, Marcel wondered if that joke might become truth. The Merlin engine was damaged, but potentially salvageable. The landing gear was destroyed, but Marcel knew his uncle had an old Citroën in the barn that might donate its wheels. The hydraulics were shot, but cables and pulleys from farm equipment could work. It was insane. It was impossible. It was exactly what his occupied soul needed, a project that meant something that could strike back at the forces that had stolen their freedom. Marcel spent the next hour carefully camouflaging the plane even more thoroughly, using fallen branches and fresh brush. He memorized the path to the clearing, noting landmarks only he would recognize. As he walked back home, his mind was already cataloging every piece of machinery in the village that might be cannibalized for parts. That evening at dinner, he watched his father's weathered face as he pushed food around his plate, the same defeated expression he'd worn since the occupation began. His mother's hands trembled slightly as she served the thin soup that passed for their meal these days. His younger sister Claire barely spoke anymore, her childhood stolen by fear and hunger. Marcel said nothing about the plane. Not yet. First, he needed to see if his impossible dream could become reality. The plan. 3 nights later, Marcel returned to the clearing under the cover of darkness, carrying a leather satchel filled with tools he'd carefully collected without arousing suspicion. The autumn moon was a thin crescent, providing just enough light to work by without exposing him. He told his mother he was meeting friends, a lie that sat uncomfortably in his stomach, but necessary. The Spitfire waited for him like a sleeping beast. Marcel climbed carefully onto the wing, avoiding the damaged section, and lowered himself into the cockpit. The instrument panel was a mess of cracked glass and disconnected wires, but his hands traced the controls with reverence. The control column, the rudder pedals, the throttle, all the pieces that had once allowed a man to dance with clouds. He spent 2 hours that night just assessing the damage, making notes on a scrap of paper by the light of a shielded candle. The engine had taken damage, but wasn't completely destroyed. Several cylinder heads would need replacing, the carburetor was cracked, and half the ignition system was missing. The wings would need structural repair where they bent on impact. The landing gear was beyond hope in its current state. The fuel system was compromised, and the propeller would need to be either straightened or replaced entirely. Any sane person would have declared the aircraft unsalvageable. But Marcel wasn't thinking like a sane person. He was thinking like a mechanic with access to an entire village full of broken-down vehicles and farm equipment. Over the following weeks, Marcel established a routine. By day, he worked openly in his uncle's garage, taking on every repair job that came their way. The Germans, fortunately, needed mechanics as much as anyone else, and they paid well, or at least they paid. This gave Marcel access to vehicles and parts that would have been impossible to obtain otherwise. He began hoarding components. A set of spark plugs from a German staff car here, hydraulic lines from a broken thresher there. He traded his meager rations for a damaged Renault engine block that had the right cylinder configuration. His uncle watched him with growing suspicion but said nothing, perhaps understanding that his nephew needed this strange obsession to maintain his sanity. The most crucial find came from Pierre, the baker's son, who had been drafted into forced labor at a German motor pool. Pierre, whose brother had died in the fighting before France fell, was sympathetic to Marcel's vague hints about a project. One night, Pierre provided Marcel with a complete ignition system from a crashed Luftwaffe fighter. Ironic justice that pleased them both. Marcel's nights became dedicated to the Spitfire. He would slip out after his family slept, making his way to the clearing with whatever parts he'd managed to acquire. The work was slow, painstaking, and often frustrating. Aircraft engineering operated on different principles than automotive mechanics, with tighter tolerances and lighter materials. But the fundamentals were the same: controlled explosions, mechanical advantage, and the conversion of fuel into motion. He started with the engine, carefully removing the damaged Merlin and laying out its components in the clearing. By candlelight, he cleaned each part, assessed what could be salvaged, and determined what needed to be fabricated or substituted. The cylinder heads from the Renault engine wouldn't fit directly, but with careful machining using files and hand tools, he could adapt them. The workshop in the woods. As October gave way to November, Marcel's secret project consumed him entirely. He'd lost weight. His eyes were constantly shadowed with exhaustion, and his mother had begun to ask pointed questions about where he disappeared each night. He deflected with vague answers about helping his uncle with late-night repairs for German officers, a lie that was partially true and seemed to satisfy her worried interrogation. The clearing had become Marcel's second home. He'd constructed a crude shelter using the plane's torn canvas and additional camouflage, creating a workspace that was invisible from more than 20 feet away. Inside this hidden workshop, organized chaos reigned. Engine parts hung from branches, carefully labeled with tags made from torn cloth. Salvaged wires were coiled and sorted by gauge. A collection of improvised tools, everything from modified farm implements to filed-down kitchen knives, lay arranged on a flat stone that served as his workbench. The Merlin engine was his first major victory. After weeks of careful work, he'd managed to replace 3 damaged cylinders with adapted automotive parts. The carburetor from a Peugeot truck, modified with hand-cut brass shims, now fed fuel into the system. The ignition system from the German fighter had integrated surprisingly well, though Marcel had spent an entire night rewiring connections to make it compatible. But engines were only part of the puzzle. The airframe itself presented challenges Marcel had never anticipated. The Spitfire's stress skin construction meant that every panel contributed to the aircraft's structural strength. He couldn't simply bang out dents like he would on a car. Each repair had to maintain the aerodynamic shape while preserving the load-bearing properties of the aluminum. This is where his uncle's Citroën came into play. Marcel had convinced his uncle that the old car, which had sat in use since fuel became scarce, should be dismantled for valuable parts to trade. What his uncle didn't know was that most of those parts were going into the Spitfire. The car's aluminum body panels, carefully cut and shaped, became patches for the damaged wing sections. Steel suspension components were transformed into landing gear struts. Even the car's seats donated their springs and padding to replace the Spitfire's damaged pilot seat. The most ingenious adaptation came from necessity and desperation. The Spitfire's retractable landing gear was destroyed beyond repair, and Marcel had no access to hydraulic systems sophisticated enough to replace it. Instead, he designed a fixed landing gear using components from 3 different vehicles. The main struts came from a farm tractor, shortened and reinforced. The wheels themselves came from a Citroën, with brake assemblies adapted from a motorcycle. It wasn't elegant, and it would never retract, but it might, just might, support the aircraft's weight. Not all his nights were spent in solitude. Gradually, carefully, Marcel brought others into his confidence. First was his uncle, who'd grown too suspicious to continue ignoring. The old man had stared at the Spitfire for a full minute before breaking into a mad laugh that echoed through the clearing. "You're completely insane," he'd said, then rolled up his sleeves. "Let me see that engine mount." Then came Sophie, a girl from the village who'd lost her father to a German firing squad for hiding British airmen. She'd found Marcel one night struggling to move a heavy engine component and had followed him silently to the clearing. Instead of shock or fear, her eyes had lit with fierce determination. "Teach me," she'd said simply, and Marcel had gained an assistant whose hatred of the occupiers matched his own. Obstacles and innovation. Winter arrived early that year, bringing with it a new set of challenges Marcel hadn't anticipated. The ground in the clearing became muddy, then frozen, making it treacherous to work. His fingers grew clumsy with cold, making delicate mechanical work nearly impossible. Worst of all, the shorter days and longer nights meant less time to work without arousing suspicion about his absences. The first major setback came in early December. Marcel had finally reassembled the Merlin engine, using a complex hybrid of original parts, automotive components, and hand-fabricated pieces. The moment of truth arrived on a frozen night when he attempted to turn the engine over manually. The propeller shaft, weakened by the crash and his amateur repairs, sheared completely, sending metal fragments flying. One piece grazed his cheek, leaving a cut that required explaining to his worried mother. Defeated, Marcel sat in the snow beside the plane, watching his breath fog in the moonlight. 6 weeks of work had been destroyed in an instant. He had no way to obtain or fabricate a new propeller shaft. It required metallurgical precision far beyond his capabilities. For the first time since discovering the aircraft, he allowed himself to consider that his dream might be truly impossible. Sophie found him there an hour later, still sitting in the snow. She brought bread, hidden under her coat, and a thermos of weak ersatz coffee. "My grandmother used to say that every problem is just a question that hasn't been asked properly yet," she told him, breaking the bread between them. "The question is how to make a propeller shaft without a machine shop or proper materials," Marcel said bitterly. "No," Sophie replied. "The question is what else can spin a propeller." Her words sparked something in Marcel's mind. He'd been so focused on repairing the original system that he hadn't considered alternatives. The next day, he visited every farm within walking distance, looking at their equipment with new eyes. He found his answer at the Moreau farm, where an old thresher sat rusting in a barn. The thresher's drive shaft was steel, solid and straight, with a diameter close to what he needed. It took 3 nights to remove it without detection, transport it to the clearing, and carefully adapt it to connect the engine to the propeller hub. He used the Citroën's transmission gears, modified and reversed, to create the necessary reduction system. It was an ugly, over-engineered solution that would make any aircraft designer weep, but when he tested it with careful hand turns, it held. The propeller itself presented another problem. The original blades were warped beyond repair. Marcel and Sophie spent weeks carefully straightening them, using heat from small charcoal brazier and patient hammering. The process was imperfect. The blades would never be properly balanced, but they were straight enough that Marcel thought they might work, at least briefly. Fuel was the next seemingly insurmountable obstacle. The Merlin engine required high-octane aviation fuel, something completely unavailable to a French teenager in occupied territory. He tried various substitutions. Agricultural alcohol mixed with gasoline, carefully blended according to formulas he'd found in an old aviation manual. None of them worked properly. The engine would sputter and die, or run so rough that Marcel feared it would shake itself apart. The solution came from an unexpected source. A German convoy passing through the village had an accident. One truck slid on ice and crashed into a stone wall. In the confusion of the cleanup, several containers went unaccounted for. Pierre, working the cleanup detail, managed to divert 3 jerry cans. They contained not aviation fuel, but high-grade gasoline meant for German staff cars. It wasn't perfect, but mixed carefully with the alcohol blend Marcel had developed, it might just work. By Christmas, the Spitfire was beginning to look like an aircraft again rather than a pile of wreckage. The wings, though still bearing crude patches, were structurally sound. The fixed landing gear stood solid, if inelegant. The engine was mounted and connected. The cockpit instruments were a mixture of original gauges and improvised substitutes. The altimeter came from a barometric pressure gauge, the airspeed indicator from a modified tachometer. Test and terror. January 1944 brought increased German military activity through their region. Rumors spoke of Allied preparations for an invasion, and the occupiers were nervous, conducting more frequent patrols and random searches. Marcel's nocturnal absences became increasingly dangerous to maintain. The near disaster came on a frozen night in mid-January. Marcel and Sophie were working on the final control cable connections when they heard voices approaching through the forest. German voices. There was no time to hide. They were in the clearing. The plane was partially exposed, and the voices were growing closer. Sophie reacted first, grabbing Marcel's arm and pulling him toward the plane. "In," she hissed, pushing him toward the cockpit. They climbed in together, cramming into the single seat space and pulling the camouflage canvas over the canopy. Through small gaps, they watched 3 German soldiers into the clearing. The soldiers were young, probably Marcel's age, conscripts complaining about the cold and their patrol duty. They stopped not 20 feet from the aircraft, one of them lighting a cigarette. Marcel felt Sophie's rapid breathing against his shoulder, felt his own heart pounding so hard he was sure the Germans would hear it. The soldiers' conversation drifted through the cold air, mundane complaints about officers' food and the cold. After what felt like hours, but was probably only 5 minutes, the soldiers moved on. Marcel and Sophie remained frozen in the cockpit for another 30 minutes, too terrified to move, before finally extracting themselves with shaking limbs. "We can't keep doing this," Sophie whispered. "Every night we come here is a night we might die." Marcel knew she was right, but the plane was so close to completion. "One more week," he said. "Maybe 2. Then we'll test the engine." The engine test came on a moonless night in early February. Marcel had prepared meticulously, ensuring every connection was secure, every component properly aligned. He'd mixed the fuel carefully, using the last of their precious hoarded aviation-grade gasoline. Sophie stood by with a bucket of water, ready to douse any fire, while Marcel's uncle watched from a safe distance, having finally been fully brought into the conspiracy. Marcel climbed into the cockpit with hands that trembled, not from cold, but from anticipation and terror. He ran through the startup procedure he'd memorized from the aircraft manual Pierre had stolen from the German motor pool. Fuel mixture rich. Throttle cracked open. Magneto switches on. Starter engaged. Nothing happened. Marcel adjusted the mixture, checked the magnetos again, tried the starter once more. Still nothing. Frustration built inside him, weeks of work seemingly wasted, when his uncle called out, "The primer. You haven't primed it." Of course, in an automotive engine, the fuel system maintained pressure. In an aircraft engine, especially one as bastardized as this, the fuel needed to be manually primed. Marcel worked the primer pump, feeling resistance as fuel moved through the lines, then tried again. The Merlin coughed once, twice, then roared to life with a sound that seemed impossibly loud in the quiet forest. The entire airframe shook violently, and for a terrifying moment, Marcel thought the engine would tear itself free from its mounts. Black smoke poured from the exhaust, and the propeller spun with a wobbling, irregular motion that made Marcel's stomach drop. But it ran. The impossible, jury-rigged, automotive parts Ampere engine actually ran. Marcel let it run for only 30 seconds before shutting it down, aware that the noise would carry for miles. In those 30 seconds, though, he felt the vibration through the control column, felt the aircraft straining against the chocks they'd placed under the wheels, felt the dream becoming real. Sophie was laughing and crying at the same time. His uncle stood with his mouth open, disbelief written across his weathered face. The decision. News of the engine test spread through their small conspiracy of believers, each one sworn to absolute secrecy. Pierre contributed more stolen German gasoline. The village priest, Father Michel, who Marcel hadn't known, was sympathetic to the resistance, provided food to keep Marcel's strength up during his exhausting double life. Even old Madame Chevalier, the seamstress, contributed, though she refused to say how she'd obtained several meters of canvas that perfectly matched the Spitfire's torn wing fabric. But with success came a troubling question that Marcel had been avoiding. What exactly did he plan to do with a working Spitfire? The plane could theoretically fly, but where? How? The fixed landing gear meant taking off would be difficult and landing would be dangerous. The cobbled-together systems might work on the ground, but could fail catastrophically in the air. And even if Marcel managed to get airborne, he had perhaps an hour's worth of fuel and no idea how to navigate or fight or do any of the things the plane was designed for. You could contact the resistance, Sophie suggested one night as they worked on the control surfaces. They have radio contact with London. They could tell us what to do with it. Marcel had considered this. The Maquis, the French resistance fighters who operated from the forests and mountains, were becoming bolder as Allied invasion seemed imminent. But contacting them was risky. The Germans had informers everywhere, and one betrayal would mean death for everyone involved in the project. The decision was ultimately made for him. In early March, German troops descended on the village in force. They were searching for resistance members, acting on information from an informer. 3 men were arrested, including Marcel's uncle. The Germans claimed they had proof of sabotage activities. Someone had been stealing parts from German vehicles and equipment. Marcel watched in horror as his uncle was dragged from his home. The old man's eyes found Marcel in the crowd and held for just a moment. A message passed silently between them. Don't do anything stupid. Don't throw your life away. But Marcel saw something else in that gaze too, a plea to make it all mean something. That night, Marcel made his decision. He couldn't let the plane be discovered. He couldn't let his uncle's sacrifice, and it would be his sacrifice. The Germans shot saboteurs, be for nothing. But he also couldn't simply destroy it. The Spitfire represented more than mechanical ingenuity. It represented defiance, hope, the possibility that their occupied existence might not last forever. He would fly it. The plan was insane, but then the entire project had been insane from the beginning. Marcel would take off from the long, straight road that led east from the village. It was the only stretch of flat, clear ground long enough for an attempt. He would fly to the Allied lines, somehow, or at least away from the village, drawing German attention away from his family and friends. If he crashed and died, at least he'd die free, in the sky, doing something that mattered. Sophie tried to talk him out of it. You've never flown before, she said, tears streaming down her face. You'll die. Probably, Marcel agreed. But if I do nothing, my uncle dies for sure, and the Germans will keep searching until they find the plane. This way, maybe I accomplish something. He spent the next 3 days preparing for his impossible flight. He read every aviation manual he could find, memorizing procedures he barely understood. He practiced in the cockpit, running through imaginary takeoffs and landings. He studied maps, trying to calculate how far he could fly on his limited fuel and where the Allied lines might be. Father Michel heard his confession, not for religious reasons, but because Marcel needed to say goodbye to someone, and the old priest seemed the right choice. On the night of March 15th, 1944, Marcel said goodbye to his mother and sister, though they didn't know it was goodbye. He hugged them tighter than usual, memorizing the feel of them, knowing he'd probably never see them again. Dawn flight. Marcel's small resistance cell mobilized in the pre-dawn darkness of March 16th. 7 people, all that remained of their conspiracy, worked with desperate efficiency to move the Spitfire from its hidden clearing to the road. They'd modified an old farm cart, its wheels wrapped in cloth to muffle sound, and the aircraft, with Sophie and Pierre underneath guiding, rolled surprisingly well on its makeshift landing gear. The road stretched straight and empty in the weak moonlight, flanked by bare winter trees. Marcel had calculated he needed at least 800 meters of clear space. He was guessing, really, based on his reading and his understanding of physics. The road provided maybe 1,000 meters before it curved, if they started from the eastern edge of the village. While the others cleared branches and stones from the road surface, Marcel performed his final checks. The fuel tanks were full. Relatively speaking, they held about 40 minutes of flight time if the engine didn't quit first. The oil pressure had to be monitored carefully. His jury-rigged system was prone to leaks. The controls felt loose, but functional when he moved them through their range. The eastern sky was beginning to gray. They were running out of darkness. German patrols would begin their morning rounds within the hour. Sophie climbed up onto the wing for one final moment. Her face was streaked with grease and tears. "You don't have to do this," she said, though they both knew that wasn't true anymore. "Tell them what we did here," Marcel replied. "Tell them it was possible." She kissed his cheek and climbed down. The others were already fading into the trees, taking cover in case German troops responded to the sound of the engine. Only Sophie remained visible, standing at the tree line, one hand raised in farewell. Marcel settled into the cockpit, strapping himself in with belts he'd fabricated from the Citroën seat restraints. The instruments glowed faintly in the darkness, the few that worked, at least. His hands moved through the startup sequence one more time, muscle memory taking over where knowledge failed. The Merlin caught on the second try, its roar shattering the pre-dawn quiet. The whole aircraft shuddered and rattled, sounding like it would tear itself apart. Black smoke billowed from the exhausts, and the asymmetric propeller created a disturbing vibration through the entire airframe. But it ran. His impossible engine ran. No time for warm-up, no time for careful checks. Lights were coming on in the village houses. Marcel pushed the throttle forward. The Spitfire lurched ahead, the fixed landing gear bouncing hard on the rough road surface. The acceleration was nothing like he'd imagined. Slow, reluctant, the engine note changing pitch as the propeller bit into the morning air. Trees flashed past on either side. Marcel's eyes darted between the road ahead and the airspeed indicator, a modified tachometer that might not even be calibrating correctly. 50 kilometers per hour. 60. The aircraft was bouncing violently now, each imperfection in the road transmitted through the rigid landing gear. 70. 80. The curve in the road was approaching fast, too fast. Marcel could see it in the growing light, see the stone wall beyond it that would end everything. He pulled back on the control column. For a heart-stopping moment, nothing happened. The aircraft continued bouncing down the road, the curve rushing closer. Then, so gradually he almost didn't notice, the bouncing stopped. The road dropped away beneath him. The wings, those jury-rigged automotive parts in canvas wings, were flying. Marcel was 3 meters off the ground and climbing. The curve passed beneath him, then the stone wall. The morning landscape spread out below, fields and forests painted in pre-dawn gray. The engine was screaming, the vibration threatening to rattle his teeth loose, but the Spitfire was flying. Behind him, he heard the sound he'd been dreading, gunfire. The Germans had responded quickly. Tracers arced up through the morning air, but Marcel was already too high, climbing steadily. Into the sky, the world transformed at 100 meters altitude. Marcel had spent his entire life in the village, knowing every road and field intimately from the ground. From above, it was a completely different country, a patchwork of geometric shapes, rivers like silver threads, forests like dark carpets. The morning sun broke over the eastern horizon, painting everything in gold and amber. And for a moment, Marcel forgot about the struggling engine, the uncertain controls, the German troops undoubtedly mobilizing below. He was flying. The control column fought him constantly. The aircraft wanted to roll left, something asymmetric about his repairs creating a continuous force he had to counter. The engine coughed occasionally, the mixture not quite right. the temperature gauge climbing toward the red zone. But the Spitfire flew, defying every reasonable expectation, held aloft by nothing but physics and desperate engineering. Marcel oriented himself west, toward where he hoped the Allied lines were, toward freedom. The fuel gauge, a repurposed automotive gauge that might not be accurate, showed 3/4 full. He might have 30 minutes. He might have 10. Every moment was borrowed time. Below, he could see German trucks deploying on the roads, tiny vehicles racing to intercept or track him. Let them try. He was free, untouchable, master of a domain they couldn't reach. His uncle was probably watching from wherever they'd taken him, seeing the impossible made real. Sophie would be crying and laughing in the forest. His mother and sister would hear the story eventually, would know that Marcel hadn't simply disappeared. The engine's note changed, a subtle shift in pitch that Marcel's mechanic's ear caught immediately. Temperature was critical. One of his hybrid gaskets was probably failing, oil pressure dropping. He had minutes, not the 30 he'd hoped for. A decision point appeared below, the River Somme, snaking through the landscape. West of it was German-occupied territory, but also closer to the advancing Allied forces. East was home, the only world he'd ever known. Marcel kept the nose pointed west. The engine coughed again, more severely this time. White smoke began trailing from the cowling. Marcel's heart sank. Coolant leak, probably. The hybrid cooling system, always the weakest part of his design. He might have 5 minutes before the engine seized completely. Below, a field, flat clear, recently plowed. It would have to do. Marcel began a gentle descent, fighting the aircraft's constant pull to the left, watching the ground rise to meet him. He'd never landed an aircraft before. He'd barely taken off. His landing gear was fixed, which was good. One less thing to worry about. But the brakes were automotive parts that might not hold the aircraft's weight. The approach was all instinct and prayer, trading altitude for distance, trying to hit the field at the shallowest angle possible. The ground rushed up. Too fast, he was coming in too fast, but pulling back now would stall the aircraft. Marcel held course, held his nerve, and felt the wheels touch earth. The fixed landing gear hit hard, harder than the bounce of his takeoff, but held. The field was soft, plowed earth grabbing at the wheels. The aircraft slewed sideways, and finally stopped, 30 meters from hedgerow. Marcel sat in the silent cockpit, hearing nothing but his own ragged breathing and the tick of cooling metal. Steam rose from the engine cowling. The impossible flight was over. He'd traveled perhaps 40 kilometers, had been airborne for maybe 12 minutes. It wasn't much. It wasn't the heroic flight to Allied lines he'd imagined. But he'd flown. A 17-year-old mechanic with no training, using car parts and determination, had taken a crashed Spitfire and made it fly. He climbed out, legs shaking, and looked back the way he'd come. In the distance, he could just see German trucks on the roads, converging on his location. Time to run. Time to find a way to disappear into the French countryside, to survive and fight another day. As he ran toward the hedgerow, Marcel allowed himself one backward glance at the Spitfire, its patched wings gleaming in the morning sun, still and silent in the field. Let the Germans find it. Let them wonder. Let them understand that even in occupation, the human spirit found ways to rise above, to defy, to fly. His impossible dream had become reality, if only for 12 minutes of borrowed sky. In the spring of 1944, German intelligence reports noted the recovery of a crashed British Spitfire that had been extensively modified with civilian automotive parts and had apparently been flown despite its condition. The pilot was never captured. Among the French resistance, the story of Marcel's Spitfire became legend, a reminder that ingenuity and determination could achieve the impossible, even under the darkest circumstances.